Good evening, sisters. I promise not to repeat all that I went through last Sunday, however. There have been some rather general questions that have come up since I have been home and have been repeated at various times, or a few that people have addressed to me since my talk in the chapel the other day. I want to emphasize that I am speaking for myself, and that I in no way could speak for all of the sisters there. And some of them I have not had sufficient time to thoroughly think through. As I said to Sister Jean today when we were speaking about one of them, I really would like to address that in community. And so although it's been rumbling around in my own mind, I haven't really set myself down to pray about it and think about it and write my ideas about it. One of the questions that people have frequently asked concerns where our sisters are and what danger they might be in. I spoke the other day about the growing dangers in Peru. Certainly in the north of Peru, where we are, in the department of Piura, we are subject to all the economic and social dangers that are part of the system of a deteriorating society. You read all kinds of figures, and I can't begin to tell you what they mean. I have never studied economics. I have read that inflation rate has been reached 8,000% this year. But the other day on the National Public Radio, I read that Peru topped the nations of the world at 2,500% inflation last year. So what all that means, I don't know. I do know that from one month to the next, when we would come down from Chalaco to buy our food in Piura to take back up, things were frequently 300 to 400 times greater in cost than they had been the previous month. Now, we as Sisters of Charity fare very well, thanks to you. Although the bishop in our diocese does provide a stipend of $60 a month per sister, we are more and more having to draw on the resources of the community. The sisters living on the coast are not receiving a stipend for the most part. I believe that Sister Mary Joan, because she teaches religion in the family program at St. Rose's in Talara, does receive something, but not even as much as we receive, $60 per month. So we are really dependent upon the community, but oh, we are so much better off than the people. Many people have no work at all. It is estimated that 65% or more have no work or are severely have insufficient employment of any kind. And when I talk about the relationship of the coca trade, I'll mention that again, but I'll just briefly mention that one of the things I read is that it's not surprising that a policeman might look the other way and let the Colombian planes come in. He's receiving a salary of $40 a month from the government, and he can earn $2,000 in less than 2 hours by just looking the other way. And he has a family to feed. And many of those who are receiving any kind of a salary are responsible for feeding other members of their families or supporting whole families. For instance, Renee was in our community briefly as a postulant and returned home, and she is from our parish, so I know something about her. Her father is unable to work because of injury, and they have perhaps 8 children in the family, 7 or 8 who are still at home. One of the boys works for the border guard up between Ecuador and Peru, and he, I know, is helping to support the family. But basically, Renee is the sole support of her family And for the last 2 years, she has taught without salary, has been trying to fight to get something from the government, and that's not unusual. Frequently, they have to teach 2 or 3 years for experience before they can begin to get a salary of some kind. Our sisters then are in the northern part of Peru, and as I said, they're a part of the systemic violence that is present there, the terrible economic situation. As yet, we are not victims of the more direct violence of the terrorists. Again, you read different statistics, different figures. Until recently, it's been commonly said that the Senderos completely controlled 3 of the provinces. That would be 3 out of approximately 21 or 24, I forget which. This year we were hearing that they controlled about 8 of them, 7 to 8 of them, almost completely. That would mean about 1/3 of Peru. Now, again, that is almost completely in the south and central parts of Peru. So from Lima south to the Bolivian and Chilean border, and then into the area that is the rainforest where the coca is produced. But we also know, and the government is saying more openly now, that they are actively working, the Sendero are actively working in all of the provinces of Peru. And it may be a matter of time until they are much more open. I know that in our Department of Piura, in the city of Piura, in the last year, several deaths have been attributed to them. And that last year when Sister Nelida was doing an interim practicum with the Jesuits there, that she was working in what they call Baja Piura, which is a very poor section, and living with the team that was working in that area. And one evening, their truck was stopped by supposedly military guards. But she has said to all of our sisters, I am sure they were not. We hear stories about other people who are driving, like a doctor who was driving back from Lima to Lara and whose car was stopped. But all that's by way of hearsay. And as yet, they are not openly operating. I am sure, and I may be mistaken because some of the ones who are much less obvious may very much be in their employ, but I am almost positive that one of the teachers in that same village where Renee works is at least a sympathizer. He has done everything he can to obstruct religion in that area and to stand in her way. So the northern part of Peru is relatively free of that kind of violence. There are other types of violence that are spawning because of the desperation of the people. Robbery is endemic. Piura is a common expectation. You walk guarded all the time. I would never wear my medal out, obviously. Most in any place in Peru. I will up in our mountain villages, but I won't in any of the cities because they'll just rip it off of you. Do you know who these, I keep talking about the Sendero, do you know who they are at all, or do you want me to say anything about them at all? Actually, they are only one group. They are the strongest group operating as terrorists in Peru today, but they are not the only. There are at least 2 other groups that are also pretty active. One is Rodrigo Franco group, which is tied to the government, we believe, and it is a far rightist group and would correspond to what you know of the death groups that operate in Salvador that are now being named probably as responsible for the deaths of the Jesuits recently. along with the military. This group of Rodrigo Franco is operating chiefly in the area around Lima also. Did murder one of the senators last year. Another group goes by an Indian named Tupac Amaru. He was a very heroic Indian who suffered great violence at the hands of the Spanish conquerors. And so they're trying to reach back and touch those sentiments of the people. They are leftists also, but do not seem to be as large or as, I can't say as violent, but they're not as large nor as operating in as many places as the Sendero. The Sendero Luminoso are what is called the Shining Path in English, and they are a group of Maoist revolutionaries. That is, they have adopted the ideas of Mao in China and transferred them to Peru. They believe that they must destroy everything that is present in the present system, the government and all social forms, in order to recreate their society. They are totally violent. They have no respect for human life in any way, shape, or form. Apparently, many of these groups had their beginnings starting in the 1960s when strangely enough, a military government had seized power, and they encouraged an exchange of ideas with various socialist countries in the world, various communist countries, and at the same time opened rural universities. And at that time, the Maoists came in to Peru. A very charismatic professor in one of the southern provinces, Ayacucho, became the leader of this group of Sendero Luminoso. We believe he is still alive, although he hasn't been seen for a couple of years, and very active. I'm told that his assistant is a former religious woman. This group actively began their program of death and destruction in 1980, so they had been kind of incubating during that period of time, but had taught many professors who are now teaching all over Peru. And in one of the Kensei Times papers this past week, it said that at least 17,000 deaths can now be directly attributed to them in Peru. There is no connection between them and any communist group in any other part of the world. In fact, they disown them, saying that they're revisionists, that Russia and China and Cuba are all revisionists. They're not pure Maoists. They're not pure communists. And so they are going their own way. Sometimes their tactics have been described briefly in this way. They began their operations up in the mountain villages for the most part, in the rural areas. They would come in, a few of them would begin to have friendly conversations with the peasants. So that right now, for instance, our bishop has warned our priests and us to be very suspect of either students returning from universities and coming in and trying to integrate themselves into our church groups, or of strangers who appear in the area and begin to circulate and talk with the people and establish camaraderie. So they begin with friendly conversations, and then sometime later they send in 3 or 4 armed persons who forcibly indoctrinate the people in what they call popular schools. And it's really a brainwashing session. They sometimes go for 12 or 15 hours at a time, and the peasants have no recourse except to be there. The next step is a kind of a Robin Hood step. They will go in and rob the stores in the area, or stop a caravan of government goods coming into the province and then redistribute it to the people, saying, this is how it will be when we are in power. All the people will share equally in the goods of this earth. If those teachers who have been present there in the village have done their jobs well, they will have engendered some sympathizers among the people already. And sometimes they will have done a very good job with the young people. Many of the persons pulled into the Sendero have been idealistic young people. And that's not too surprising because they can't get any work in Peru. And so there's a natural appeal when a new order is suggested to them. Frequently they will then involve a few of the villagers in some kind of a violent activity against government officials. For instance, they might stop a convoy of government trucks coming into the area and tell them to go bomb them, blow them up. And the peasants will do that either because they believe in what they're doing or because they're very effectively persuaded by the guns in their backs. And following that, the senderos fade off into the hills very rapidly, and the government comes in and does the rest of the work for the sendero. 2/3 of the deaths in those areas have been attributed to the government forces. And they come into the area and mow down the people mercilessly. Men, women, and children. So when the government has done that, or the military has done that, the sendero's job is done for them. And when they come back into the village, they have little need to persuade the people. I'm told that in other areas where the senderos have operated, have gained control, maybe similar to what we've heard something about in East Europe. Some of the people much prefer their control, even though it's brutal, but at least they know where they stand. And there is some law and order. They prefer that to government control, because very often that's very spasmodic and the people don't know where they stand and they don't know what's going to happen to them, and sometimes the activity of the government forces is at the whim of the particular leaders. The Sendero considers the democratic left as their principal opponents right now, which is very interesting. The strongest political party in Peru presently is said to be the Izquierda Unida. It's a union of socialist parties, left of center. But they do have some very good leaders, and when I talked to Trini on November the 11th, she said that their party had won in my village and in many of the villages in the Sierra. But I don't think we have much to fear from them. They are teaching socialism, yes, but they are not communists. And because they are not communists, because they're not purist, the Maoists don't want anything to do with them because they're also teaching reform, but in a nonviolent way. There is a Peruvian Izquierda Unida senator who has said that one of the problems in the present political situation is that the present government and many others refuse to recognize that millions of Peruvians who live in oppression and misery see the subversives as alternative. And that's in large part because of the corruption and ineptness of the government. He says political democracy does not mean real democracy in this country. The state is weak because the people do not identify with it. Now, in that regard, and for a little bit more optimistic viewpoint, during my talk in the chapel the other day, a sister had passed out these papers, which is a part of a campaign that is presently going on throughout Peru. This says Pura Vida y Paz, but it could say Peru or Lima or whatever. Life and peace. And as you see, it's a heart symbol with a dove superimposed. The sign of life and peace. And alongside it says, let us unite our forces. Let us summon our wills. Let us act now, because there are reasons for hope. And in that campaign, I think interestingly enough, although the religious leaders and civic leaders who are a part of that campaign are saying to the people, yes, the government is responsible for much of what you are undergoing right now, both the government present and past, but you can't claim that it's all their fault. Each one of us has to take our responsibility. And when we are passive, when we don't admit to our own faults and our own willingness to stick our neighbor, our willingness to take advantage of the person next to us, when we see violence going on in the streets and we turn our head the other way, or when we know about our neighbor who is in real need, our family that's suffering and dying of hunger, and we don't do anything about them, then we're responsible. And so they're saying, if we want to conquer this situation in Peru, it's not going to be a government that can do it. We as a people have to overcome the problems that are present. And they name a whole list of problem areas: the material poverty, the hunger, sickness, the anguish and fear that is present, the death that surrounds them on many sides from many different causes, discrimination against people of darker color or of different nationalities or whatever. Actually, I was very surprised to find in both Bolivia and Peru how cosmopolitan it is. There are many Asiatics there. There are many people of different areas. And when I was in Bolivia, it was interesting to me. Any number of people came up to me and said, "Are you German?" And I said, "No, but my ancestors were." And so there are many Germans who fled to South America, as you know, either during World War II or afterwards. Marginalization of women, that has always been a part of the culture of Peru. Women are abominably treated, very often like beasts of burden. A wide separation of classes, and it is growing, a very wealthy elite who are profiting by the coca trade also. And so they say, unless you begin on your own level to start to try to combat these, then you cannot really blame the government. And as I said to the sisters in chapel, I think that many of those same problems are present in the United States today, are they not? And maybe we need to say the same thing to ourselves. This campaign says you need to engender a righteous indignation, and you need to combat them however you can, wherever you are. I think it's good for us to hear. Another question that has been frequently asked is about the cocaine trade and whether the people in Peru use coke. They have always, for 2,000 years or more, have used cocaine, but in a very mild form, and they did not grow it terribly extensively. They chewed the leaves to deaden their hunger pains. They wore it in their hats because it took away their headache. They bound it on the stomachs of their children to relieve the colic. And they used it in many, many ways. I drank coca tea when I was in Bolivia. The sisters had it there in their house. It's a good sedative for an upset stomach. There are Peruvians who use cocaine, but that's not the biggest problem. That's an increasing problem in some of the cities where there are some addicts. But the biggest problem is that between Bolivia and Peru. 90% of the cocaine in the world is grown in those two countries. And I heard recently it's 70% of that is in Peru. Some years back, the government had sent people into what was the river or the rainforest areas, and that's about 2/3 of the country, and had ripped out the trees, much as you read about being done in Brazil today, and had sent them in to farm, but they didn't give them the materials to work with, and so their crops failed. And then the cocaine merchants came along and persuaded them to plant these crops, and they began to earn a lot of money. One Peruvian sociologist, Edmundo Morales, who is an expert on the cocaine industry, believes that unless an alternate economic force replaces the coca leaf, it will continue to thrive. I think that's a common feeling. Coca leaf production in Peru brings in an estimated $1 billion per year, non-taxable. And it says, he says that the coca profits go mostly to the ruling sectors of Peruvian society, members of the national elite, middle-class officials, and police authorities. He talks about the domestic police, as I mentioned a little bit ago. They can make much more money by looking the other way than by pursuing it. And he also says something else that I think is very interesting. He talks about how the senderos have ties with the narco-traffickers, and that the rebels espouse a fanatical political ideology, while the narcos control a $70 billion a year industry, most of it being shipped up here, as you know. So they've gone into kind of a combine. The narco traffickers pay off the senderos to keep the government forces out, and the senderos use their money to buy weapons to kill people. And that's where the principal source of their funding is coming from today. There's another area that I had not thought about before. He says that another complicating factor is that the drug enforcement bureaucracy itself wants to grow. It's government jobs. And so they don't want to see it eradicated necessarily. And you can add to that that the arms producers in Peru are gleefully anticipating a multi-million-dollar contracts as the contest increases. So who's caught in between? The peasant farmers. They cannot get decent prices for ordinary crops, and so they have, in large part, ceased to farm, to grow potatoes, coffee, whatever. And they have more and more been usurped by the coca dealers. Even the way it touches us, people from our villages the fathers leave their families because they cannot earn a living for them and go to the coca fields to make ready money and then come back. And that also presents another message. Young men are doing that too. And it's saying to the kids in school, this is the way. This is the way to make a life. I'm sorry, I had several other questions, but I think my time is up. And so I'll stop there. Maybe some other opportunity will present itself. Follow other two questions about who the senderos are and what the problem is with narco-traffic in Peru. Some of you have asked me, are you afraid to go back? I would like to look at that in this way. In the sense defined by Webster of being afraid, that is, to be filled with alarm, to be timid or stricken with fear, or to be apprehensive of disaster, I have to say, no, I am not afraid. And presently, I do not even feel fear. But will I? Yes, of course I will. Should we find ourselves living in even more violent conditions, not knowing who are our real friends, who may be senderos, who may be informers, even among teens in the parish. It would be crazy for one to say that he or she did not feel fear. But hopefully it would be in the sense that Webster again defines fear as a painful emotion or a passion excited by the expectation of evil or the apprehension of impending evil or danger. That is, that it's a healthy emotion that will really give people extra energy to do what they must do in a given situation. I would hope that it would be a prudent fear that is accompanied with the desire to avoid or ward off evil. That it will be a natural human passion that will excite us to provide for our own security when it is needed. A precious blood priest who is currently giving workshops throughout Peru for the Conference of Major Religious said in one of them, "There is no one who really looks for martyrdom because there is no point in dying. Death is not of value, life is." And so it would be in that sense that I would hope that we would learn better how to deal with our fears. In these workshops being given by Confer, they are explaining certain strategies that religious of Latin America may use in helping them. One of the first ones is to recognize one's own limitations. It is simply a biological reality that some people cannot withstand fear over a long period of time because it really does sink into the bones and take hold of the nerves, and it cannot be put off by sheer willpower. It's far better for a person who is dominated by fear to communicate honestly with her community, with her superiors, and without any sense of moral weakness to ask for a change. Other people will need to learn to take more free time to process what is going on within themselves. They probably will need to attend seminars and support groups along with the people living in zones of violence. And all of us will need to develop much more support and trust within our own local communities, and a sense of freedom to share our fears, again without a sense that we are being weak in doing so. But how should we live our faith and perform our pastoral duties in situations of violence? I would like to explain something that Father Ranley said in these conferences. As a precious blood priest, he has a very special devotion to the agony of Christ in the garden, and he gave an entirely new interpretation of that for me. He said that first of all we must remember that Luke, who is writing, and he is the only evangelist who describes the bloody sweat, that Luke is a Greek physician speaking out of that culture. And he said that Greek athletes prepared for their events by pushing their bodies to the extreme, even to the point where blood would flow from, or not flow, but be pushed through the pores of their skin. And that Luke, in writing about the agony in the garden, is describing Christ preparing himself for his own passion and death. He says that like Christ in the agony, we religious and priests and the people of Latin America must learn with Christ to prepare ourselves. And so, in order better to live our faith in these situations and to go about our duties, we need to process some of it beforehand, and we need to conquer it as best we can through prayer and through a sense of solidarity within community and with the people among whom we are working. We will feel violence and even a sense of aggressiveness on our own part, probably, before given situations. And that will make us, hopefully, cry out more to the Lord. We are being urged to pray the Psalms, the prophets, Job, both among ourselves and with members of our religious groups or communities within our parishes. And in a sense of our own impotence, we must acknowledge that only the Lord can save us. Therefore, we want to share with the people and with our community the suffering, our prayer, and our joys. And with the help of the Gospels, we want to continually look for what God is calling us to in any given situation. We want to accompany the people in creative ways and with audacity. In order to do this, we need to have criteria or key that we have attended to and prayed about beforehand so that we do not try to improvise on the spot. We need to confirm our solidarity with actions, however small. And we need to announce the God of life, valuing whatever is positive that is done by whomever it is done, and developing confidence in persons, celebrating life and faith. How do we want to live in these zones of violence? Father says it calls for much flexibility to know how to take advantage of the real moments to develop greater solidarity, to accept what is and what cannot be changed, to construct really living communities of support and prayer, to find those places where we can best serve, recognizing that we may not be able to continue some of the things that we have been doing in the past. We need to exercise both courage and prudence, leaving to God to judge whatever is done, to act in serenity and security, to plan and act always with the lay people and never by ourselves, to listen well to the people and to learn from them, having an attitude of dialogue always, not thinking that we have the answers, and to accompany our work with the joy and humor and freedom of the Spirit. In all of this, then, we might also address another question that I myself posed when I spoke to some of the sisters on the eve of the new year. Father had said that we must prepare ourselves. He said that every community has in its own charisms a spirituality of martyrdom, and that we need to probe our own history and charism to see what that might be. I said then I did not have to look very far in our history to see what that might have been for the early sisters. Who can doubt that those young sisters coming up the Mississippi and then the Missouri River into Indian territory might have expected to meet their own martyrdom? Or the sisters who first went to Helena and arose their first morning to see the hanging tree outside of their window. What fear must have been theirs. There are many other times in our history, maybe not quite as dramatic, but I think that it called for a sense of martyrdom for those sisters who ended up eating grass during the time of the terrible drought, or who were faced with the plague of grasshoppers that consumed all of their crops. But they had a sense of being sent, of being where God asked them to be. And so I guess when I try to think a little bit about our charism, and as I said at the very beginning of this tape, I think that we need to probe this together in community, and so I'm only beginning to look at these things. When I look at our charism, I see first of all that in our Constitution we say that we are called to live our life, first of all, in the sense of our baptism, that the beginning and end of our coming together as Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth is our Lord Jesus Christ, who in his church has called us now in these days to worship the Father with our whole lives. And in the strength of this calling and in this spirit, we vow our lives to God in charity, to love and serve one another and our neighbor, whoever that may be, and whatever the need according to our resources. I believe that that calls for a spirit of martyrdom in many cases, in the daily living out of our lives. We further say that the Christian believes that God is Father, Son, and Spirit who transcends the world and is in it, that God is Spirit who transforms the world and brings it to perfection, that Jesus came into the world, and by his living, dying, and rising, every Christian is called to bring the kingdom to its fulfillment. I believe that excuse me. I believe that is what we are about as sisters of charity. It calls for a dying to self daily. To be called Christian is to say that in him we live, move, have our being. And that is wherever we are and whatever we are doing. For me as a sister of charity, one of our greatest devotions has always been that to divine providence, to being where we are called to be, when we are called to be there, and doing that to which we are called. For me at this time, that has a special resonance because 25 years ago or more, I volunteered to go to the mission several times. And it was not until 3 years ago that I was accepted for that mission. It was not until the year that I arrived in Chilocco that the diocese began to extend its teachings on human rights and teachings on the Constitution of Peru and creating committees for that. And I thought that it was very interesting given my own background and teaching experience here in the States. We are called in humility, simplicity, and charity to be with the people. There can be nothing more humbling than to know that there is not much that you can be or do except to be with the people in their time of suffering. And it calls for great simplicity to be with and to learn from the people. And that is certainly the situation we are in, more than ever before. And charity, only the charity of God would impel us to be with the people in their present sufferings. And so I believe that indeed our history in charism is calling us in a very special way to be in Peru at the present time. And I cannot leave out that how could any of us, or at least for myself, how could I not go back to Peru when presently we have 8 fine young women who are called to be Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth and who still need us to help them establish the community in a more real way there. So we thank you for your prayers, your support, and we count on you to continue them.